These images are some of the images of activists in the field of intersex equality, and in fact, they were all taken, if I'm not mistaken, in Brussels at one of the ILGA Europe events, in fact, ILGA Europe and ILGA events, bringing together intersex activists from around the world to meet, sometimes for the first time, and also develop the program, if you will, of the intersex movement that was at its infancy in 2011. So that's not too long ago, that's 4 years ago only. This sex binary is what affects all of us. For most people, it's easy. It's the easy thing to do. You just choose the toilet to the left or the toilet to the right. That's it. Simple. For other people, it's more complicated because those symbols are not just toilet symbols, but they are the symbols that have harmed them throughout their life because they're not able to exist even according to who they are, but they have to fit one of the other boxes that don't necessarily respect who they are adequately. So the sex binary is really pervasive in our society, and it renders intersex people invisible. That is not to say that intersex people don't identify with male or female. That would be incorrect to say. But it's the classification that is used that is what is problematic. Now also, as Dennis clearly indicated, the sex assignment at birth, it determines the life course of individuals. So both in terms of the legal person, who you are in front of the law, but also socially, okay? Both socially and legally, you are that person, and that sex is gonna follow you for the rest of your life. In some countries, you can change that sex and to align it to your gender, but it's a problematic process. You have to modify your body, you have to divorce your partner, and so on. And why would someone have to do that just because, if you will, they were recorded badly at birth? So what is intersex really? And if you still pose the question after Dennis's presentation and my own, it's not unique to you. I'm sure that several people in this room don't fully know what intersex is, precisely because it's so invisible in society. Intersex individuals are persons who cannot be classified according to the medical norms of so-called male and female bodies with regard to their chromosomal, gonadal, and anatomical sex. The latter become evident, for example, in secondary sex characteristics such as muscle mass, hair distribution and stature, or primary sex characteristics such as the inner and outer genitalia and or chromosomal or hormone structure. So those of you who thought that, at birth there are these people with ambiguous genitalia and it's just those people who supposedly are not male nor female and you can immediately tell, that is not the case. With the number of intersex people, nobody would know at birth. So you can imagine how many mistakes, if you will, happen during registration, and then how many would need to have it corrected after. That flag is the symbol, if you will, of the newly developing intersex movement around the world, and has been chosen to indeed claim a separate strand in human rights discourse, and also to show that intersex people are not necessarily trans people, and there should not be the automatic link between one and the other. So what is the problem? The problem is the invisibility of intersex people that have left them fair game for harmful practices, but also discrimination in society. As a result of the surgeries and the sex-altering medical interventions on their bodies and their person, intersex people are denied their right to physical integrity and their ability to develop their own gender identity. Why do I say that? Of course they can develop a gender identity, but if your body has been altered to be aligned with one sex and rather than the other, and even if you develop according to the other gender or intermediate gender of sorts, it's very difficult for you to be the person who you would like to be. These interventions often harm the physical and mental being of intersex people. So important, it's not just the physical part, but also the mental aspect. As I said earlier, the International Intersex Forum has been, I think, one of the channels that has allowed the intersex voices to be heard. It's not the only one. This picture is taken at one of those fora, and this picture comes from 2013. There were, of course, also there was work done by the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, who issued a viewpoint, as well as the initial study by the Fundamental Rights Agency. But prior to that, there was work happening elsewhere, and we should not restrict ourselves to think in terms of Europe. So the San Francisco Human Rights Commission back in 2004 had already a report out, and the New Zealand Human Rights Commission in 2011 did the same thing. So where has this all started? Where has the medicalization process started? It all comes from the medical knowledge or science of the 1950s, where there was this growing belief that sex could be altered and the child could be reared as male or female, and then on the basis of the way that child is grown up, that child will grow to identify that way. So basically gender identity was linked to the socialization process. And therefore, if you're socialized one way, you're going to act that way. If you're socialized another way, you're going to act in a different way. This belief was further popularized through the case of David Reimer, who was transitioned to female following a botched circumcision. So basically, his penis was burned, and they thought they could transition him into female. Call him Brenda, grow him up as Brenda, and then Brenda would be happily ever after. And that's the way it was presented in the research studies that followed up. Brenda was said to be a happy girl. Little did they know that Brenda was gonna retransition to male and eventually suicide. So that's the sort of harm we're talking about here. So interventions on intersex children became routine following the promulgation of this case, but also the science that followed, and continues to this day. So those of you who think that this is something that used to happen but is no longer happening, you're wrong. It continues to happen to this day. And interventions, interestingly enough, contrary to the general practice of medicine, are not justified in terms of the well-being of the person, but are justified in terms of social grounds very often. Like, how can this person survive in a male and female world? So instead of changing the male and female world, we change the person to fit that person into the male and female world. In medical nomenclature, you will not find reference to intersex anymore. Since the year 2006, a decision was made to refer to intersex issues as disorders of sex development, further invisibilizing, if you will, the intersex body and rendering it as just, aspects of, well, disorders here and there that can be fixed through intervention. This is one experience. There are others recounted in the issue paper of an intersex person, Christian Volling from Germany. So she says, the castration that I suffered and the paradoxical administration of high-dose testosterone considered as necessary, resulting in physical and psychological damage such as hot flushes, depression, sleeping disorders, early osteoporosis, the disappearance of my sexuality and my reproductive capacity, trauma linked to the castration, lesions of the thyroid glands, change in my brain's metabolism and my bone structure, as well as many other secondary effects and lesions. The male genitalia surgically constructed have caused irreversible damage such as chronic urinary infections, disorders of urination, strictures, and scarring. These interventions have made my me lose all my innate feeling of belonging to a sex and all sexual behavior. So that's the problem, okay? But gladly, perspectives are changing. The Swiss Ethic Council, for example, is of the belief that intersex children are able to make decisions around their sex towards the age of 10 to 14, and that they should be allowed to develop with their body without any intervention until they are free to make decisions if they feel like making such decisions. Mika Venhola, a Finnish pediatric surgeon, refuses to perform any unnecessary interventions on intersex infants. Also, the UN interagency, including WHO, issued a report last year calling for interventions on intersex infants, a breach of human rights, and pointed out that all interventions have to be with the full, free, and informed consent of the intersex persons themselves. Any other interventions would be contrary to the principle of health. So the human rights at stake. There are quite a few actually, of course, and intersex people are, like all of us, protected by the human rights framework, so it applies to intersex people like it applies to all of us, as simply to the fact that they're human. And also, there is a growing and emerging human rights position coming from all sorts of institutions, also from Europe, but a lot of it is coming from the UN agencies, that are increasingly vocal against these interventions and are vocal for the rights of intersex people. The right to life is, to this day, preached through prenatal screenings and abortions, as well as infanticide in some countries, perhaps not in Europe, but it happens still. Then there is the intervention itself is considered as a form of torture, and this special rapporteur, UN special rapporteur on torture, has described it as such. Then there is the sheer respect to the private life and the body of the individual, the right to health, the best attainable standards of health for all persons, as well as the rights of the child, the best interests of the child, but also the rights to identity of that child, and so forth. Legal registration, therefore, needs to be questioned as it currently stands. Should the registration of sex on birth certificates remain obligatory in such a short period of time as it often is? And should it be restricted to male and female? Should there be alternatives to that? Should we rethink the whole system? Also, one needs to think in terms of the flexibility in assignments. Sometimes you may believe that a child belongs to one particular sex, but in fact, it will eventually turn out that the child did not belong to that particular sex. And because a mistake, if you will, was performed at the moment of assignment, that should not affect the person. Society should have a system of allowing for greater flexibility in that regard. Also, we need to think in terms of non-binary gender markers. This does not necessarily come most strongly from the intersex movement. I think the trans movement has pushed this one the furthest. And here a point needs to be made again that intersex people are not necessarily outside the male-female concept. Many do identify as males or females, but that does not mean to say that all do. And therefore, there should be a space for those who don't to have an alternative marker to that one. Now, in terms of non-discrimination and equal treatment, there's quite some development. As was said during this conference, South Africa was the first country to include a definition of intersex in its legislation, and also linked that definition to the grounds of sex, including a clear prohibition of discrimination on that ground. In Australia, progress has been achieved as well with the prohibition of discrimination under the ground of intersex status. Also, interestingly, Australia has guidelines on sex and gender that form part of the way government documents, and therefore the way government should function. In the case of Malta, the new law offers perhaps the highest level standard of protection that intersex people enjoy in the world until now, through the new right to physical autonomy, the prohibition of discrimination under the ground of sex characteristics, and the fact that sex characteristics has been mainstreamed in a number of laws, including anti-hate crime provisions as well as the Equality Act, and a provision on mandatory promotion of equality in that same Gender Identity, Gender Expression and Sex Characteristics Act. Also, there is no need to assign a sex to a child until that child reaches the age of 18 and can assert one's gender identity. So that's it. Thank you.